Come on.
He is waiting for you in the board, between the portal to this world and the next. He goes by many different names, and once you let him into your life, it may never be the same. Welcome to From Beyond. Tonight I'm sharing some true ZOZO stories, and stick around till the end for the most terrifying tale of all. In March of 2012, I received a call from my friend Tonya Madia. Tony and her husband Joey have interest in the paranormal and have both had numerous experiences throughout their lives. Tonya had recently received her grandmother's old Ouija board and had been using it in experiments. After a disturbing session, she placed a call to me. The first thing she blurted out was, "Have you ever heard of an entity named ZOZO?" She said she and a friend, Michelle, had used her grandma's board to try and contact Michelle's mother, who had passed away about 4 years earlier. Michelle had been having recurring dreams in which her mother seemed to be trying to give her a message, so they thought the board might provide a clear avenue of contact. They smudged the room with sage before beginning to cleanse the environment, lit a candle, and meditated. Then they placed their hands on the planchette. They asked if anyone was present, and the pointer moved to the moon. "Is this moon?" they asked, not taking the response seriously. The pointer moved to the clouds. It seemed they had a communicator who was in a joking mood. After that, the board answered a few questions with vague responses, and then it spelled out, "I'm looking for ZOZO." "Who is that?" they asked. "Are you ZOZO?" the board replied. "No, we are not," they said. Neither had even heard the name before. But then the pointer started spelling out rapidly, "ZO, ZO, ZO." In her head, Tonya said she could hear the entity laughing. Tonya and Michelle decided they weren't going to make any more progress in the session, so they decided to shut it down. And as they were about to close it, the entity announced, "Actually, I am ZOZO." They ignored it and closed the session. After this, Tonya said she didn't have any contact with that demon again. I mentioned the connection between the demon ZOZO and the other names it goes under. When I mentioned Mama, she said a chill ran up her spine, and she said she had encountered Mama when she was a teen. Her great-grandmother Clara, the owner of the board, had psychic abilities and an interest in the occult and paranormal. She frequently used the Ouija board and for most of her life also engaged in automatic writing. She was an aspiring writer but never published a book, but she said that some of her fictional books were dictated to her via the board. When Clara visited Tonya and her family, the Ouija board always came out, and Tonya always watched with great fascination. When she turned about 10 or 11, she was allowed to participate. And after a few years, when she was 14, Clara moved in with her family in Arizona. At the time, Clara had a spare board, which she gave to Tonya, but admonished her that it was not a toy, but something to be treated with great respect, and she should always put a white light around herself before using it. Tonya and her friends used it nearly every day after school, until one day, an entity named Mama showed up. It was very dark, Tonya said. It said it had murdered her children. Things got scary, and when we said we didn't want to talk to it and to go away, it kept coming back and dominated our sessions. The girls berated and laughed at Mama, and when it threatened them in return, they dared it to do something. It did. Tonya started having horrible, violent nightmares. In one, she crawled up the wall to the ceiling. In another, she became a snake and slithered through the house to her parents' bedroom with the intent of biting them. She would awaken in the middle of the night to find her radio had come on by itself, and strange sounds rang out through her house. She felt watched by something, and she said whatever was watching her had a malicious intent. Once, she looked in the mirror and saw her face become old and hag-like, with long black hair. Tonia's grandmother discovered what the girls were doing and angrily read them the riot act for their carelessness and disrespect towards the board. She took it away from them, but Mama didn't leave. She plagued Tonia for about a month more. A fundamentalist friend told Tonia that if she burned her tarot cards, the phenomena would stop. Tonia did, destroying a fine old deck, but the activity didn't stop. Finally, after a few months, the presence faded. Clara eventually moved out again to live alone in a trailer. She lived in a remote place in Arizona called Sholo, about 180 miles northeast of Phoenix. It was, as Tony described it, smack dab in the middle of nowhere. And she kept copious notes on her Ouija sessions and automatic writing. When Tonia was about 21, Clara was killed in a car accident. Tonia went there to pick out the keepsakes that she wanted, and she took all the notes, including her Ouija board transcriptions as well as some of her paintings. It was then that she took the old board. Back home in her apartment, Tonia got out the board to use it by herself, to see if she could contact Clara. "Grandma, are you here?" she said. The pointer moved quickly. "Yes." "Do you have a message for me?" "I told you never to use this," said the board. Stunned, Tonia quickly put the board in a box and at her first chance returned it to the trailer, which sat empty, save for the board and a few other of Clara's possessions. Once, Tonia, her 2 sons and her husband Joey went out to stay in the trailer, but when they arrived they found an open notebook on the table. It read, "Welcome, I hope you had a nice journey." It was written in Clara's handwriting. As the sun went down, paranormal activity started. First with strange noises, and the family slept huddled together in the living room on the floor. Banging, thumping and creaking went on all night around them, and the noises seemed to emanate around the space where the Ouija board was. The next day they moved the board to a storage shed outside the trailer, but they said the next night the noises were even louder, and now they were coming from the shed. The next day they packed up and left. After this, Tonia said she had no interest in using the board again, and as far as we know, she hasn't touched it since. Chris Sloan-White of Nova Scotia, Canada, and several friends undertook some long-distance Ouija board experiments and found themselves in contact with an alternate ego of the demon that we're discussing tonight, ZOZO. The entity they contacted was calling itself Z1. Back in the spring of 1986, Chris was temporarily living at home while attending community college. He'd never used a Ouija board, though he and members of his family had a long history of paranormal experiences, including bedroom invasions by shadow people and the feeling of dark presences around their home. At college, Chris befriended a student who was obsessed with the Ouija and was full of fascinating stories about his experiences using the board. Chris was intrigued, and his new friend urged him to give the board a try. Curious and interested in something different to do, Chris agreed. They lived 30 miles apart and devised a plan for remote board experiments. Chris would gather some of his friends at his home, and the other man would gather friends at his home, and they would both work the board simultaneously to see if they could communicate board to board across a large distance. Chris didn't own a commercial Ouija, and so he made his own board. All the participants assembled at the appointed time on a Thursday evening. Neither Chris nor his classmate knew the names of the other's friends who were present. Chris and his own friends opened with the typical question, "Is anybody there?" Their mood was light and jokey. They tried to make contact with the other board, and after a short time, their planchette moved. Chris asked who was at the other board and got 2 sets of initials. He called his classmate, who verified that the initials given matched 2 of the 4 persons who were present in the other room. Then 2 spirits made themselves known on Chris's side. One called itself Z1, and the other said its name was CG4. Chris said, as the night wore on, about 2 to 3 hours in, these 2 beings seemed to fight over who would stay on the board. Z1 seemed to want to scare us, make threats, and just be plain nasty. It kept saying, Z1 has the power. We shouted back that it didn't, and that seemed to anger it even more. It spelled out the name Darcy, who was my girlfriend at the time, and then spelled out sick. I called her, and she said she was ill. It also told me I would die on my birthday. After a while, the thing didn't want to leave or say goodbye. It was getting late and everyone was starting to get pretty scared. And it was around this time that the other entity, CG4, came back. You could just tell the difference on the board. You could feel the air in the room get lighter, less charged. We asked CG4 if we could say goodbye, and it said we could. It then spelled out, Z1 will never have the power. When we said goodbye, it spelled God will save the young, and then slid to goodbye. The atmosphere in the room didn't feel dark anymore. In fact, we felt kind of pumped up in a way, victorious almost, when that final message was spelled out and we managed to close the session. I'd always thought of that night with skepticism since, but after finding out that other people have had similar experiences with this entity, I now think I may have truly encountered something demonic that night. The demon itself goes by many names. The Collector of Souls, the King of Kings, and the Owner of Power. It's possible that CG4 was actually a guardian spirit or angel who intervened on the boys' behalf to protect them that night, knowing the demonic power they were up against. Once they closed the session, the boys moved on with their lives. One of Chris's friends, though, did report that when he was using his recording equipment to duplicate a tape afterwards, all he got was static every time he tried to use any of his audio equipment. He said it was working completely fine before the night they used the board in the same house. This story was related by Rosemary Ellen Guiley in the book Ouija Gone Wild. I've had my own experiences with ZOZO, though it always uses the alternative name of Zaza. The first appearance the entity made to me was in 2010, during an investigation of the haunted Lincoln Theatre in Decatur, Illinois. The theatre has numerous haunting phenomena, including apparitions, shadow people, strange noises, and footsteps. The great stage magician Harry Houdini once performed at the theatre, and had a special trapdoor cut in the stage floor for his escape acts. The basement of the theatre is a concentrated zone of paranormal phenomena, especially near Houdini's old trapdoor. I've investigated the theatre many times, and have obtained real-time EVPs with my Ghostbox radio device. In 2010, I ran an informal experiment with the Ouija board. The 2 primary board operators were Nicole Tito and Lisa Crick from the Ghost Research Society in Chicago. The session was videotaped by Joey Tito from the GRS and Craig Talisha, a paranormal investigator tech expert from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Nicole and Lisa make an excellent team in investigations, as their synergy seems to enhance spirit communication. Together, they get quite a few quality EVPs doing their investigations, but they had never before tried working the Ouija board together and had no idea what to expect. As the session began, the temperature in the area around us dropped dramatically. Then, unexplained banging noises surrounded the group. I was not surprised when the planchette took off beneath Nicole's hands, and the first communicator identified itself as her great-grandfather, Max. That stream of communication didn't last long, however, and the planchette began to wander aimlessly about the board, spelling nonsensical words that made no sense. Soon after, Max disappeared. Asked to identify itself, the new communicator was vague, but kept spelling words with lots of Z's in them. "Do you communicate with Rosemary over Frank's box?" asked Lisa. "ZPZ," spelled the communicator. "Are you ZOZO?" I asked. "ZAZA," answered the board. "Are you Jinn?" I asked. The communicator refused to answer more questions, but instead sent the planchette zooming back and forth rapidly between Z and A, spelling Zaza over and over again. The movement of the planchette became so violent and repetitive that I terminated the session. Nicole and Lisa were spooked, but none of the participants suffered any paranormal fallout. Thankfully, Zaza, or ZOZO, remained on the other side. I asked Lisa and Nicole for their impressions afterwards. Lisa said, "I think that he pushed Max out. When Zaza came through, it was like it amped up the environment 200%. It was like reading different handwriting, and it scares the hell out of me now that I've seen the Ouija work. I want to use it again, but only as long as I'm with folks I trust completely, and there's a cleansing prayer done afterward." This story is recounted by Eric Altman, the president and founder of the Pennsylvania Bigfoot Society. He said, "This story is a very strange one, and I have no explanation for it. I've often wondered if I was being taken advantage of or possibly was a victim of a hoax. But what happened took place at Thiel College in 1991. I was dating a girl named Mary at the time. Mary and her friends got hold of a Ouija board and thought it'd be fun to play with it. They played for several weeks, just thinking it was harmless. But when they played with it, they almost made contact with someone, or something they said was named Maz. It never spelled any other name, just Maz, every time they went on the board. I was in the room and witnessed this on several occasions, but I never touched the board. I wasn't sure if I believed in it at the time, but after all I'd heard and read about the boards, I didn't want to find out. After weeks of the girls playing, they claimed they began to notice strange things happening in their dorm room. They saw black shadows on the walls, icy cold temperatures in the rooms, even with the heating turned up to high. I was witness to the icy cold temperatures even when the room thermostat was set for 80 degrees. I just figured that since Mary lived at the end of the hall, her room was the last before the outside wall, so maybe a cold breeze was coming through, and that was why. Mary began to have nightmares, almost nightly. Some of them were pretty disturbing. She would dream she was dead and attending her own funeral. She would call me at all hours of the morning to come down and sit with her because she was so upset over these things. And on several occasions, my roommate and I would go down to her dorm and sit with her until she calmed down. Eventually, she asked me to get rid of the board, and I agreed. One night, she and I took the board out to a local lake in Pennsylvania. We put the board in a plastic bag, filled it with rocks, and threw it out into the lake. It didn't go out very far, maybe 10 or 15 feet, but far enough so I heard it hit the ice on the lake, break through the ice, and go under. That's when I experienced several things I have no explanation for. That night, as we drove home from the lake, Mary found the planchette on the floor of the passenger side of the car. She handed it to me and told me to get rid of it. I had the steering wheel in my right hand, rolled down the window, broke it into pieces and threw it out the window as we drove. As soon as the planchette left my hand, I lost control of the car, and we spun several times on the road before stopping. We weren't speeding at the time, and the road wasn't icy or wet. Thankfully, neither of us were hurt and there was no damage to the car, but we were pretty shaken up. When we got back to the college, though, things got even stranger. I hope you're enjoying tonight's story so far. Let me know your creepy Ouija board encounters in the comments below. And please like and subscribe to get notified as soon as I post new videos. I said goodnight to Mary, dropped her off at her dorm room and went back to mine. But the next morning she called me crying and begging me to come down to her room. When I arrived, I saw a bag propped up outside of her door. It was the same bag we'd thrown in the lake. It was wet, and the bag had water in it. Mary said that when she got up to go to the bathroom, the bag was just waiting outside her door. I talked briefly to the college pastor and told him that Mary and her friends were messing about with the board. I described some of the things that she claimed she was experiencing, and he told me to get rid of it. He said just break it into pieces, throw it away, and be done with it. A few days later, while Mary was in class, I got the board. I broke it in two, and I broke those pieces in two and threw them all into a dumpster at a different location far away from her dorm. Just in case she and her friends were playing a trick on me, they wouldn't be able to find them. I never saw the board again, but Mary continued to have nightmares, and things happened in her room up to the point where she left school. She ended up joining the military, and that was the last I ever heard from her. I don't know where she ended up, but I still wonder if she made any of those things up to get to me because she knew my interest in the paranormal. But to this day I can't explain the cold drops in temperature, how I lost control of that car, or how that bag with the board and the rocks still in it was outside her room that morning. The following accounts are taken from the book Real Haunted Ouija Boards by Zachary Knowles. Educated in science and logical reasoning, doctors are probably the least likely people to believe in a spiritual world or the ability to communicate with it. They also witness death on a regular basis, and would probably have a hard time coping with the paranormal if they really did believe in it. Despite this, the board did manage to convince one young doctor that he may have contacted an evil entity. The 30-year-old doctor found himself playing with the Ouija board one night after his 22-year-old sister brought it over for some late-night scary entertainment with a few of her friends. The very first time the planchette moved, the group was contacted by a person who had committed suicide recently and said he had a message for someone in the room. The doctor and his sister were the only ones touching the planchette and had no knowledge of this spirit or what had happened to him. Still, they were able to act as mediums and delivered intimate details between the spirit and his friend, who was understandably very startled by the communication. Another night, they decided to give the board another try, but they found themselves communicating with a very energetic spirit who kept spelling ZOZO over and over again. Frustrated, they let it be, closed the session. They tried again the next night. This time the spirit spelled Mama at an alarmingly quick pace. They tried asking it what that meant and what its name really was, but it wouldn't give them a clear answer. The planchette just zoomed around the board and then it started making a figure 8. At one point, it started counting down the alphabet backwards. The doctor and his friends had had enough and decided to stop, but when they took their hands off the planchette, it continued moving frantically for a few seconds before finally coming to a stop. This next story by Anonymous is truly one of the most haunting tales I've heard. The young man, growing up in a quiet town, was never interested in wasting his time with Ouija boards. One day he saw a moving van on his quiet street and went over to introduce himself to the new neighbours. This was when he met Anna. She was 18, just like him, and lived with her two younger sisters, ages 16 and 13, and their mum. Anna and the young man became great friends, and he liked her, even though she was into the boards and spiritualist things. Her mum was a tarot card reader, and got all her daughters interested in communicating with the paranormal. One day, the young man decided to invite Anna over to his house. Of course, she wasn't there long before she asked him to play with the board. He agreed, and soon enough, Anna was talking to some spirit, asking it all kinds of questions. He started to become a little afraid of the whole thing, and the only question he really remembered Anna asking was, "So what do you do in life?" Through the board, the spirit responded that he had been a bus driver. Anna said, "Show yourself." The planchette moved to goodbye. The young man never thought much of it. That was until 2 weeks later, when he discovered that Anna had been hit by a bus, and she died. At a funeral sometime later, Anna's sister, Grace, approached him about the Ouija board. She insisted that she had been communicated with Anna since her death. The young man said the spirit isn't her, leave the board alone. Her sister Grace began to cry, and eventually convinced him to come over to her house so she could prove it. But he wasn't surprised when the spirit they contacted claimed to be Anna, and he didn't believe a word of it, although he didn't say anything because it seemed to be giving Grace comfort. Grace said to her sister through the board, "I just wish I could see you again. Goodbye." The session was closed, and Grace and the young man never spoke about it again. He was still a skeptic, but then towards the end of that year, there was another accident, this time involving Grace. Soon after she got her driver's license, she was hit by a bus and killed. So perhaps the bus driver that was contacting them through the board actually completed both of their requests. It was 2012, and April had just moved in with her sister Joyce. One evening, the two sisters decided to have their friends Trevor and Melissa over for a bit of fun. They were all having a smoke at the back and pondering what to do when April suggested that they should play with a Ouija board. April loved the idea of asking the spirits about the afterlife, and she had played with the board alone for many years and said nothing bad had ever happened. So the four sat at their kitchen table together, gathered around the board. Joyce and the others weren't such strong believers, so April decided to lead the game. "Is anyone there?" she asked. Slowly, the planchette moved to yes. "Who are we speaking with?" she asked. The planchette moved again, this time sliding to Z, then to O, then to Z, then back again. It wouldn't stop moving between those two letters, and it started picking up speed as it moved back and forth. Trevor and Melissa looked baffled. "What do you want?" asked April. The planchette moved quickly. H-E-R. "Who is her?" The planchette moved again. It spelled Melissa's name. Melissa smiled slightly, thinking it was a prank, but her smile faded when she saw how scared April was. "What do you want with her?" April asked. The only reply they received was, "I want her," spelled quickly, and then it resumed sliding back between Z and O, zipping back and forth frantically. The group started getting fed up with this vague but energetic spirit. Frustrated, Melissa said, "The spirit's a prick." As soon as the insult left her mouth, the planchette stopped. Slowly, it began moving around again, spelling out, "Death." "Why did you do that?" asked April. "You could be capable of doing something really horrible to us." Melissa sat quietly, a little shaken and ashamed, but the others decided to try and continue the communication. Soon, April noticed how warm the planchette felt under her fingers. In fact, it seemed to be getting hotter. "Do you feel that?" said Joyce. The others all nodded. "Are you angry?" April asked, with a sense of foreboding. The planchette started moving around so fast that no one could keep up with the letters. It seemed to be stuck in a rut, and started spelling M-A, M-A over and over again. April decided to try and force the planchette to a different letter, but she couldn't move it, she said. Trevor pulled his hands away. "I'm done. This is too weird." That was when the atmosphere completely changed. As soon as Trevor's hands pulled back from the planchette, there was a presence in the room. The air became heavy and fear crept into the room. Suddenly, April didn't feel like herself anymore. Somehow, she said she knew that something was inside her. And from nowhere, a strong feeling of hatred washed over her. Then she started laughing, and she had no idea why. The next moment, she was in tears, and she had no control over her emotions anymore. But that wasn't all. As she felt the feeling of hatred creep in again, as tears streamed down her cheeks, she found herself slowly turning towards Melissa. She smiled. Afterwards, April said she didn't feel like it was her doing these actions. There was something inside of her. Joyce couldn't take this, and as April was smiling at Melissa, she slammed the board shut and said, "Trevor's right, this is just getting creepy." Everyone jumped up from the table, but April still felt like she was in a trance. She said she could still feel something dark, boiling under the surface. After a while, she slowly started to return to normal, and she said that whatever had entered her body was really powerful. She said if ZOZO had wanted to hurt one of the others, she wouldn't have been able to stop it. Dina was about 10 years old when her aunt and uncle gave her a Ouija board when they visited from St. Louis. Like her family, Dina assumed it was a harmless game just to pass the time. She really enjoyed playing with it and did so regularly over the years. Sometimes strange things would happen while she played, but those weird occurrences never scared her, not like they did her friends. As she got older, she lost interest in playing with the board. Years later, when she was in her early 30s, she went back to her hometown with her 2 young children for a visit. Dina's old friend Murph had passed away recently, so she and her other childhood friend named Buddy went to Murph's house to say goodbye. When they arrived, Dina felt nothing, but Buddy, who said he was a bit of a psychic, instantly knew. "He's there, Dina." They decided to go inside the house and use Dina's old board to try and contact Murph to say goodbye. They said it was like he'd been waiting to speak to them, because as soon as they started the session he responded immediately, moving the planchette quickly around the board. Dina and Buddy tested the spirit to see if he knew things only Murph would know, but it seemed to be him alright. He even had the same sense of humour that everyone had loved about Murph when he was alive. He said he was happy, and the 3 of them communicated all night through the board. The following night, alone, Dina tried to contact Murph again. He wasn't there. Someone else answered. The spirit said, "ZOZO is coming." Dina had no idea what it meant, kept trying to get the spirit to talk about other things, but all it continued to do was warn her. She closed the session, and that night she lay in bed in her childhood home, unable to sleep. She heard the sound of footsteps across her bedroom floor and quickly flipped on the bedside light. She saw a dark figure sitting at her desk on the other side of the room, which quickly faded away in front of her eyes. After this, she struggled to get to sleep. The next day, she got online and searched for any information about a spirit called ZOZO that was tied to the Ouija board. At the time, she found nothing, so she didn't give it any more thought. A few years later, Dina's now teenage daughter Jill brought home a fancy glow-in-the-dark board. Jill tried it out in the living room while Dina was getting ready for work. But immediately, Dina's daughter was contacted by ZOZO. The spirit said he'd been waiting a long time for her to talk to him. He told Jill that her mother had opened the gate years before, and when Dina entered the living room, Jill told her what the spirit had said. While Jill was telling this to Dina, the planchette moved again on its own. "Hello, Dina," it spelled. Disturbed, Dina told her daughter to burn the board and left for work. Jill obliged, refusing to let the demon into their lives anymore. Dina did another internet search at the time. Now, strange encounters with the demon had appeared all over the internet since she had last looked. All of them were terrifying. She couldn't help but wonder how so many people had encountered the same evil entity she had learned of years before. And was it really waiting for her behind the gate that she had opened all those years ago? Thanks for listening. Let me know your creepy Ouija board encounters in the comments below. And I'll see you next time on From Beyond.